Okay, this video is, are cancer and dementia the same disease? And then I put total body ischemia. Okay, and what's the point of this lecture? That modern medicine has made an excessive focus on genetics and pharmacology. And genetics, the reason everyone's so excited about genetics, it was this big breakthrough, molecular biology, 1953, Watson and Crick solved the structure of DNA, and England used to be awesome at molecular biology, and there's this tendency to try to attribute things to genetics. Genetics is hardly ever even relevant. Okay, yes, some people have more of a genetic predisposition to one disease or another, but almost everybody benefits from the same approach, a low-fat, vegan, low-sodium. And what I'm getting at is there's a tendency, I remember when I was in medical school, you learn all these different diseases and then you play the game of match the ill to the pill and send a bill. And you never really knew what caused the disease. Why did the person get this disease? It was just bad luck, idiopathic, And so what I'm trying to say here is it turns out most diseases are metabolic. That's an important point. Most diseases are metabolic. So it is good for a person, if they want to understand a disease, to learn about metabolism. Okay, and that usually means they're due to a problem with nutrition, the diet, and due to toxins like estrogenic chemicals and other things, herbicides, pesticides, that sort of thing. And the great benefit of understanding that most diseases are caused by metabolic problems is that most of these diseases can be prevented. And if they're treated early, many of them can be cured or at least minimized. So here's the point. What's the most common cause of dementia? It's hypoxia. Now, in other lectures I've given on dementia, I've talked about the concept of mouse equivalence with dilatory, tying off the mouse's carotid arteries. I talked about my experience studying excitotoxicity and how you can ramp up metabolic demand relative to oxygen glucose delivery supply. And that's the main thing that causes dementia. The whole Alzheimer's thing, I've talked about how that's mostly bogus. And the whole point is hypoxia leads to neurons dying, and it's called apoptosis, programmed cell death, because they don't have enough oxygen to meet their metabolic demands. What's the most common cause of cancer? It's hypoxia. That's the Warburg effect. He won the Nobel Prize in 1931 studying in tissue culture how you make different types of cells hypoxic, and many of them die, but some of them will transform into cancer. It's like a vestigial pathway that they can activate to burn glucose anaerobically and make energy from it. So anyways, that's my key point. So where's the great good news in all this? Well, the same thing you would do to prevent dementia is the same thing you would do to prevent cancer and a whole bunch of other diseases. So it totally makes sense to do this. This is about as high yield an activity as exists in this world for humans. Okay? So what are the risk factors for hypoxia? Of course, tobacco. Excessive dietary fat. You make the blood thick, increase blood viscosity. You can call it rouleau formation with the LDL cholesterol sticking the red blood cells together. You can call it blood sludge with the thickening of the blood non-specifically from vegetable oils. That causes tissue hypoxia. In addition, it's going to cause hypertension. High blood pressure causes endothelial injury of the arterial lining cells. That leads to atherosclerosis, which leads to tissue hypoxia. The excessive dietary fat leads to insulin resistance. It overwhelms the mitochondria, intermitochondrial membrane proton gradient, causes a backup of electron transport, inhibition of glycolysis. That leads to insulin resistance. You can't get glucose into the skeletal muscle cells postprandially. Normally 80% of them go there. I got separate lectures on that. And that leads to hyperglycemia. The hyperglycemia causes endothelial injury because endothelial cells cannot regulate how much glucose comes into them. They just go by whatever amount of glucose is in the blood, and then they get overwhelmed by excessive glucose entering the endothelial cell, and that will overwhelm the mitochondria, intermitochondrial membrane, proton gradient. Again, I talked about that in all my diabetes lectures. Okay, that'll cause atherosclerosis, leading to tissue hypoxia. Excessive sodium because of the vasoconstriction, also because of the hypertension, endothelial injury, atherosclerosis, tissue hypoxia, just like I described above here. Okay, alcohol largely gets made into fat, causing fatty liver, leading to the same cascade of events, insulin resistance, diabetes. Okay, has other direct toxic effects. Excessive estrogenics, they're everywhere, in the water, they're in the preservatives, etc. We talked about that. My lecture on female problems is the one where I go into all the estrogenic stuff in more detail, but in the end, it leads to tissue hypoxia. mouse equivalent. So these are the things like chronic cerebral hypoperfusion. You know, mouse equivalent meaning that in his lab, Jack Delatorre, the PhD who did the great, who came up with this great theory of dementia, and it's the great. This one, and then sort of the concept I've talked about, excitotoxicity with regard to apoptosis because can't meet metabolic demand. Those are the two most important causes of dementia. That Alzheimer's stuff is a sidetrack of BS, okay, for selling drugs. It's totally overrated. It's bogus, all right? I talked about that in separate lectures. All right, the mouse equivalents. Chronic cerebral hypoperfusion can be due to atrial fibrillation. You lose the atrial kick from filling from the atria because they have discoordinated contraction. You can get congestive heart failure, inadequate pumping of the heart, not enough blood gets to the brain, overtreated hypertension, dropping the pressure too low from too much meds, carotid artery atherosclerotic stenosis, drops blood to the brain, obstructive sleep apnea, hypoxemia at night. They'll drop their SAT, some of them into the 60s for prolonged amounts of time. Diabetes, hypoglycemia. If they overtreat themselves with insulin, now that they got the CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, they're seeing that a lot of diabetics are dropping their blood glucose quite a bit at night. So anyways, that was the point I want to make, that it can be overwhelming at first. Oh my gosh, all these different diseases, how can I ever learn this? And what I'm basically saying is, if you learn the root causes, the major metabolic problems that I give a whole bunch of lectures on, you dramatically reduce the risk of these diseases. And it's not that complicated. It's all pushing towards the same thing, ischemia, okay? And ischemia means lack of blood flow. So one really can make sense out of a lot of this stuff and really help people if the person's willing to change their diet, change their behavior, which, of course, most aren't. But at least you got a chance to help yourself, help your family, help the few patients that actually understand this and are willing to try it.